slot a few days from now, Lord willing. When I started the ministry, not many people were interested in that kind of ministry. In fact, many people do not feel comfortable with the fact that Muslims can be saved and that we can share the eternity with them. John wrote in the book of Revelation about his encounter with a heavenly vision, and he said, I looked and behold a multitude that no one could count, from every nation and tribe and tongue, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, dressed in white, holding palm trees. Folks, there will not be any segregation in the city of Jerusalem. That city is as diverse as any major city. And God wants it to be diverse all the way. And people will come from all nations, including the Arab nations, including the Muslim nations, when they come to Christ through the gospel of Jesus Christ, and are saved, and we will share the eternity with them. And I have been humbled to have a front row seat to see God's work among Arabs and Muslims, and how God has been working in the hearts of those Arabs and Muslims to change them, to deliver them from darkness to light and from death to life. The thing of Islam and the religion of Islam and the Muslim people has been something that is marketable, that has been selling well in the past few years, so to speak. When I started the ministry in January, not many people, once again, were interested in that ministry. And then 6 months later, something happened, not in the United States, but across the ocean, that brought all the world's attention to that kind of ministry. The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, aka ISIS, declared itself a worldwide caliphate. And suddenly people started to call, and congregations started to invite. What is Islam? Who are Muslims? How did Islam start? Why do people convert to Islam? How can we deal with that situation? How does Jesus Christ look at that thing that is called Islam, and how to preach the gospel to the Arab and Muslim people here in the United States as well as in other countries? I will share a few tips on how to preach the gospel to Arabs and Muslims in my class about reaching out to the Islamic people, as somebody worded it. But in order for us to preach the gospel to any non-Christian, Muslim or non-Muslim, we have to start where they are at. We have to understand the theology of Islam and the beliefs of the Muslim people. And in order for us to understand the theology of Islam, we'll have to understand the history of Islam, and we'll have to learn what went wrong in God's plan, if anything can go wrong, that eventually gave birth to a religion that is called Islam. Folks, many of you remember the Summer Olympics of Seoul, South Korea in 1988. I'm talking about the men's 100-meter sprint. Millions of people around the world, including my parents' house in Baghdad, were watching because there were big names in that sprint. The referee fired his pistol. The race started. The crowd cheered. The announcer was excited. Ben Johnson, Ben Johnson! And Ben Johnson won that race. Well, a few days later, they found out that Ben Johnson was doped. He had some of those performance-enhancing drugs. And they said, well, he does not deserve the first place or the gold medal, so they took the first place and the gold medal from him, and they gave it to the second person, Carl Lewis. Folks, we have been doping the Christian faith and the Christian community worldwide. We have been saying that Christianity is the largest religion on earth. Jesus Christ would beg to differ. Because he said, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many people will come to me on that day and say, Lord, haven't we prophesied? Haven't we done miracles? Haven't we healed in your name? And I will say to them, depart from me, I never knew you, you who practice lawlessness. And so if you disqualify those who have been doped and counted with the Christian community worldwide, those 2 billion people who claim to be Christians, then Islam would be the first religion in the world. That deserves some attention. How in the world can a religion as large as Islam, which once again in my mind deserves number one, in terms of the numbers of followers who are obedient to that religion, a religion that is that big, a religion that's had that much of an impact in the world as Islam, a religion with that many followers, a religion that's been around for that long, 14th century so far. How did this all start? Did God not see that coming? And folks, it doesn't work when we run away from an issue that is as violent as Islam and that's as influential as Islam. Let me give you an example about the inherent violent nature of the religion of Islam. Religion of Islam. Separate religion from people, please. This has been a mistake that politicians have been making. You have been hearing, well, I will not judge an entire religion based on the actions of the few. Well, you don't mean the religion, you're talking about the people. The religion can be bad, but most of the followers, in my mind, are so good they don't want to go all the way in obeying the requirements of the Islamic faith. Which, let me give you an example how violent Islam is. Raise your hand if you know a Syrian-American director by the name Mustafa Akkad. 1, 2, okay. Okay, now raise your hand if you're familiar with a classic horror series by the name Halloween. Everybody knows that. Well, he's the producer of that series. But Mustafa Akkad is more known in the Muslim world for producing another movie. A hit that was so big, it almost won the Oscar for the best original score. Has Star Wars not been produced in 1977? And that movie is called The Message. A movie that tells the story of the life of Muhammad and the history of the early Muslims. That movie is so big in the pop culture in the Arab and Muslim world that people quote it and reproduce scenes from it whenever they talk about the life of Muhammad and the history of Islam. Just like you would think of the movie Titanic when you talk about the doomed ship. Or The Untouchables when you talk about Al Capone. Or Patton whenever you talk about, well, General George S. Patton. People talk about The Message when they talk about Islam. That movie has shaped the Muslim community today. The director was killed in November 2005 when he was staying with his daughter in the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Amman, Jordan, by a truck bomb in an explosion that was executed by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The man who made a movie about Islam was killed by people inspired by his own movie. That's how inherently violent the religion of Islam is. Is that a reason for us to hate the Muslim people who are born in a faith that they had no idea that faith and religion is a personal conviction that you can either choose to follow or choose to reject, and they think that's their culture and their heritage and their skin color and their DNA is Muslim and there is nothing that they can do about that? No. Religion is bad. People are good. Separate the two if you want to address the root of the issue that we are struggling with today. And so in tonight's class, we will be talking about the history of Islam, the origins of the religion of Islam. Folks, Islam did not start from scratch. I mean, there wasn't anyone who was smoking weed and decided, hey, let's start a religion and make a new scripture and redefine who God is and who Jesus is. Let's redefine heaven and hell. And let's talk about life and the afterlife. There were some origins to the religion of Islam that, in fact, the Bible is giving us references to what went wrong in God's plan because of the imperfect people who were involved in the perfect plan of God that eventually gave birth to the religion of Islam. I actually have two classes that go with each other and talking about the origins of Islam. One of them before the life of Muhammad, the founder of Islam, and the other follows the life of Muhammad himself and the history of the early Muslims. And to give an illustration to my story, I'd like to start with one of my favorite authors, Ray Bradbury. I have read many of his books. I love this man. He's so lyrical in his style and so creative in his imagination. And one of the stories that he wrote, short story by the name A Sound of Thunder. It was made into a movie, I think, a few years ago. In that story, a man goes to a Chicago-based time travel company, pays them $10,000 to go back in time to the age of the dinosaurs to hunt T-Rexes. And the company told that man what would be the rule in every time travel movie and time travel novel. Do not mess with the past. Do not touch the delicate balance of the time in the past, because the slightest change that you can do to the past would drastically alter the future, and it would not go right. The man goes to the past. The company actually provided him with a metal path so that he would not even step on the floor of the past. The man sees the T-Rex. He panics. He steps out of the metal path and he steps on a golden butterfly. And when he goes back in time, he sees that the dinosaurs are still living. And hence the expression, the butterfly effect. The concept that the slightest change that you do to a delicate system and a perfect plan can bring some consequences, undesired consequences to this plan. Folks, God had a plan, a perfect plan to redeem us, mankind, to himself. He talked about that plan. He actually said that he purposed this plan, the blue line that we see in this screen, from before the foundation of the world. And that plan was supposed to end up at the cross when Jesus screamed, "It is finished." But some of the people that were involved in that plan made a few mistakes, stepped on a few golden butterflies, and that caused God's original plan to be skewed off into an alternate direction, giving birth eventually to Islam. And we will be talking about 7 of those examples, as many as the 7 red arrows in this diagram. The first mistake, the first act of the lack of faith that those people who were involved in God's plan did, that eventually gave birth to the religion of Islam, is the very first act of the lack of faith in the Bible, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. A perfect world, Adam and Eve, a world without pain, without suffering, without death, and with only one rule: do not press the red button. Well, Adam and Eve said, "Well, I wonder what would happen if I pressed that red button." And we know the rest. Man chose to sin, and that sin caused a separation between man and God. Isaiah says in chapter 55 and verses 1 and 2 of his book that your iniquities have separated you from your Lord. And that separation was lethal before God's plan was done. You would not dare get close to God, to the throne of his mercy. If you get any close to any physical place that was designated to be the place of God's presence, if you look into the Ark of the Covenant, if you touch that Ark, if you enter the Holy of Holies, you will surely die. And that scary scene of separation with God was especially obvious at the foot of Mount Sinai when we read in Exodus 19 when God invited and called the children of Israel to make a covenant with them a year after he saved them from the bondage in Egypt. And he said to Moses in verse 10 of Exodus 19, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and let them be ready for the third day, for on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai and the sight of all the people. And we later read in verse 18 that Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Folks, now you can appreciate whenever you pray and you have that direct access to God through the blood of Jesus Christ, that privilege has not been available all throughout history. The Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. The children of Israel came to a conviction that the separation with God was so lethal, they demanded that God would send them a mediator, somebody to deliver God's message to them. And we read about that request in Deuteronomy 18. Verse 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet. This is Moses speaking to the children of Israel right before they entered the Holy Land. From your midst, from your brethren, him you shall hear, according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb, that is Sinai, the scene that we have just read about a few minutes ago, in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let me see his great fire anymore, lest I die. And the children of Israel waited, and waited for that prophet, and waited. And when the fullness of time came, John the Baptist was baptizing in the Jordan River. And the Jews went to John the Baptist and they asked him, who are you? Are you that guy? They were also expecting the Messiah that the Old Testament spoke about over and over. And they were expecting Elijah that would come before the Messiah and prepare the way before him. And they asked him in John 1 and verse 19, who are you? He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, I am not the Christ. And they asked him, what then? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. They said, are you the prophet, as in the prophet of Deuteronomy 18? He said, no. The children of Israel, the sincere ones of them, would soon realize a man that was attested by God through signs and miracles and wonders. And they would say, surely this is the prophet that is to be sent to the world. The Samaritan woman knew that he was the prophet. The 5,000 plus people that he fed in John 6 knew. In verse 14 they said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Later on, Peter would be talking about Jesus Christ in Acts 3 and quotes Deuteronomy 18. And even later on, Stephen would be talking about Jesus Christ, and he also would quote Deuteronomy 18, telling the people that the prophet was no other than Jesus Christ. And to this day, the Jews do not believe that the prophet has come, and they are still waiting for him. And that is the second instance of the lack of faith. They did not believe in Jesus as the prophet. Folks, when Muhammad was born in the late 6th century, 570 AD, and especially when he started to claim to be a prophet sent by God in 622 AD, there was a whole culture in Arabia that was waiting for the prophet of Deuteronomy 18. It's a mistake to view Islam through the eyes of the Old Testament Judaism and the New Testament Christianity alone. Arabia was filled with cults and heresies, mostly Bible-inspired and Bible-based. Apocryphal scriptures and Jewish Christian churches that eventually evolved into Islam. When Muhammad claimed to have received his first revelation from God, he told his wife, and the wife went to one of the priests of those cults, and he told her, truly, this is the law that has come upon Moses, and this is the prophet that is to come into this world. The third instance of the lack of faith that eventually gave birth to Islam was the lack of Abraham's faith in the Lord's command to go to the promised land and his providence in the promised land. In a quiet post-flood world, God appears to a single faithful man, Abraham, and he commands him in Genesis 12, a chapter that would start a scene that would go across the rest of the Bible, to get out of your country, that is Ur of the Chaldeans in the southern part of the modern-day Iraq, from your family and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Later on we read, in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Paul exposes to us that the blessing is our forgiveness, and the seed is Jesus Christ. Abraham leaves his family's house and he goes to the Holy Land of Canaan. We read later in verse 10 that there was a famine in the land and Abraham went down to Egypt to dwell there. That's the mistake we're talking about. Abraham did not have faith in God's providence, so he did what God did not ask him to do. In fact, God would specifically tell his son after him, Isaac, when he does that same mistake, I don't want you to go into Egypt. What's wrong with that? I mean, what does that have to do with the religion of Islam? Folks, I know how disappointed Abraham was, because there is nothing that is more disappointing than someone that comes all the way from his home country of Iraq all the way to the promised land, only to be told that the economy is bad. When Abraham went to Egypt, we know the story, the king of Egypt liked his wife, and Abraham lied, and he said, well, she was my sister, and we read that the king dealt well with Abraham for her sake. We read later on in verse 16 that he treated Abraham well for her sake. He had sheep, the king gave Abraham sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, among whom we will be introduced to a woman by the name Hagar. And the small mistakes go on, and the ground is being prepared for the religion of Islam to start. Folks, this is not just a history lesson. There is a deep moral lesson from this class, and a big challenge for all of us, starting with the speaker. God has a perfect plan for you. Do not mess it up. Amen. If you want to leave this class with one thing in mind, make sure it's that thing. Abraham was 75 when he was promised a child. And he waited for that child for over a decade, over 2 decades, 25, 24 years, and that child did not come. Well, how long are you ready to trust God to fulfill his plan for you? And that's why Abraham succumbed to his wife's suggestion, and he took Hagar and he laid down with her. When he had the mistake of the lack of faith in God's promise that He will give him a child. How did that work for Abraham? How does that work for us when we try to pursue our own plans? Ruining the perfect plan of God for us, who will do His plan but will not leave us without consequences to deal with. I'm talking about 1.5 billion people, consequences to deal with. Hagar became pregnant. She ran away from her mistress into the cruel desert of Arabia. A sad scene of a pregnant Egyptian maid looking for water. The angel of the Lord comes and comforts her, but that comfort did not come without strings attached. And we read in Genesis 16 and verses 11 and 12 that the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him." This passage